So first let me thank you, my thanks to the Kenyon Institute and to the Educational Bookshop for hosting this launch, and Mandy, thank you very much for inviting and making this possible. It's my great pleasure to do this book launch of the book called, as you see, The Naqab Bedouin and Colonialism, New Perspective. As Mandy said, this was just like that? Okay.
Yeah, or maybe hold it if you find that easier.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So this book was just published by Routledge. It's edited by Mansour Nasasra, myself, Richard Radcliffe from Oxford University, and Sarab Abu-Rabia-Queder from Ben-Gurion University. What I want to do in this introduction is to just provide the background to the book and briefly summarize the content, what our aims as editors was with this book. So the book is the outcome of a conference that we organized, the four of us, in Exeter University in 2010, in the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies and the Department of Politics. And this conference was funded by the British Academy. It was the first international conference that dealt specifically with the case of the Naqab Bedouin. And from that conference we selected 9 papers altogether to form this book, which was published just now. So the aims, we had 3 main aims with this book in general. The first was to fill the gap in Palestine and Middle East studies on the Naqab. There very little literature exists on southern Palestine, on the south, and what exists has also been dominated by certain paradigms, into which I want to go later in this introduction. But just to briefly give an introduction, I mean, you're probably all familiar, but I wanted to introduce the Naqab Bedouin. The Naqab Bedouin consists of circa 200,000 Palestinian Arab citizens of Israel. They mainly live in the metropolitan area of Beersheba in the northern Naqab. Historically, they have been administratively segregated from the rest of the Arab population in Israel, and until very recently, they have been considered a peripheral minority within the Israeli and Palestinian political landscape, and often they were romantically being thought of as socially and culturally distinctive from Palestinians. Now it is with this kind of literature and with this kind of assumptions that we wanted to critically engage with in our book. So the second aim was to engage critically with the existing literature on the Naqab Bedouin. So we are mainly concerned in the book also to trace the knowledge production, the phases of knowledge production on the Naqab Bedouin. Briefly, the Naqab Bedouin were first studied by European travelers and colonial administrators who often put forward a very typical Orientalist perspective on the roaming nomads in the desert. But they have also then become a zone of theory for Israeli social science, where a body of ethnographic scholarship has developed, which often continues to be dominated by an Orientalist paradigm, but even more so by a modernist paradigm, where it is claimed that the Bedouin need modernizing to be integrated into the modern state. However, in the last decade or so, last 2 decades we can maybe say, there has been a change in the wider knowledge production as well as in the political profile of the Naqab Bedouin. And this, we were thinking, has potentially repositioned the study of the Naqab Bedouin more widely within Palestine studies, within the studies of indigenous peoples, within settler colonial paradigms, and also within a variety of other approaches, subaltern approaches. So the third aim of the book is to follow on from this new, more critical literature and think about the ways in which the study of the Naqab Bedouin can be more broadly integrated into Palestine studies and studied from a settler colonial perspective. Now, as I said, one of the main questions that we were thinking through in the conference and then in the book is who produced what kind of knowledge on the Naqab, at what time and for what purposes. So I want to, just as an introduction, provide a very brief and therefore also necessarily sometimes maybe not precise enough, but I'll try, overview of this historical development. I want to provide a genealogy of the study of the Naqab Bedouin. So in the Ottoman period, in the late Ottoman period, the Bedouin in Palestine were mainly discussed by European travelers and traders, who, such as Alois Musil or Burkhardt, who very often put forward a romanticized image of the an Orientalist and romanticized image of the roaming nomads in the desert. There were also attempts already at this time to survey and map the community. Surveys were conducted by the Ottomans and Egyptians, and first maps of the community were produced. Is it raining?
Yes. Do you have a gun?
Oh, hopefully it stops. I just carry on until it gets more. Now, during the British Mandate, Beersheba was conquered by Allenby in 1917 and served as the administrative center for the Bedouin in southern Palestine. By employing Bedouin sheikhs in key positions, the British largely managed the Bedouin through this form of indirect rule. There were also attempts during that period, during the Mandate period, to map and survey the community with the support of aerial techniques. Work was produced largely, or to a large extent, by bureaucrat scholars and colonial who were part of the colonial administrations, such as Arif al-Arif. So here, Bedouin customs were discussed and reflections on the culture were provided, but there was already an aim put forward here of not just how do the Bedouin live in the desert, but how to rule them. But generally, we can see that in the period of the British Mandate, culture was largely prioritized as an explanatory paradigm in this Orientalist framework through which the Naqab Bedouin were studied. Now, after the Nakba and with the establishment of the State of Israel, overwhelmingly the Bedouin tribes were expelled. And the remaining tribes, an estimated number of 11,000 to 13,000, were placed under military law and segregated in an enclosure zone. So so the tribal system, the Israelis reorganized the tribal system into They reorganized them into administrative tribes, around 19 appointed sheikhs, who became de jure intermediators between the Bedouin and the military authorities in return for a range of local privileges. There were also surveys conducted on the population, of course, with all of this as part of the political project and the political processes of ethnic cleansing and enforcing colonial rule. Now, in this early period of scholarship under the military rule, the paradigm of culture remained prioritized. So tribal culture remained central. There was still a focus very much on looking at the Bedouin customs, but also more and more on political practices, on law, on legal structures, all of course with the aim of governing. So here the focus really shifted on how to rule the Bedouin. But the studies put forward in this time were quite thorough in exploring the economic and political structures. What is specific about this literature of the early Israeli rule under the military period is that the Bedouin were always presented as distinctive and in isolation from other Palestinian communities. They were presented as somehow resilient, nomadic people who were different from the Palestinian national project. Now, from the late 60s onwards, the Israeli government embarked on a policy of sedentarizing the Bedouin. All in the name, or in the official narrative, was that this would serve national development. But I think, of course, we should rather understand it as a policy aimed at making and forming modern state subjects, and at making the modern citizen legible and therefore also governable under the state system. So Bedouins were forcibly moved into 7 urban townships, and the scholarships in this period saw generally a shift from a focus on culture and rituals and customs to one really so from this paradigm of Orientalism to one centered around modernization theory. So it is from the 70s onwards that really we see a scholarship emerging that focuses on how to modernize, in inverted commas, how to modernize nomadic society and integrate them into the state. So we can see we can see that this is in a way part of this scholarship forms part of a broader field of scholarship of peasant studies or nomadic studies, which are largely concerned with modernization and sedentarization. So the questions scholars ask were how does the Bedouin population adapt to the modern environment of the cities? What kinds of techniques of adaptation, and generally this period was presented under the umbrella of the end of nomadism and modernization. Now, with the Oslo Accords, an interesting dynamic started to appear, which is that from the late 1990s onwards, the Bedouin here also the Bedouin were increasingly integrated in the mainstream structures of the Israeli local government, with local municipal councils being established. So this meant that the Naqab Bedouin, from being peripheral to the Israeli political space, became increasingly significant. They were also becoming increasingly significant for the Palestinian scholarship as part of the Palestinian minority in Israel, and as a symbol and an embodiment of the notion of discrimination against the Arab Palestinian citizens. So it is in this, from the 19th onwards, that the new, more critical scholarship on the Naqab Bedouin emerged, which covers a wide range of disciplines: gender studies, socio-legal studies, education studies, political science, etc. And broadly, this literature is interested in the agency and in forms of agency and countering discrimination and marginalization of the Naqab Bedouin, who are often presented as subalterns struggling in a settler colonial context, indigenous and subaltern struggling in a settler colonial context. Now, this transformation also, or in parallel to this, linked to this shift in the knowledge production, is the fact that increasingly there emerged an NGO system that studies the Naqab Bedouin. So there has been a huge rise of NGOs in the south, from 4 Bedouin NGOs in 1994. There are to date more than 80 registered, and there are new coalitions organizing demonstrations and lobbying, and we know particularly since the PROA plan that the case of the Naqab has been much more politicized and much more also linked to the wider Palestinian struggle. Now, I went through these historical phases very fast in order just to highlight that the shifts in knowledge production, of course, are linked to broader historical dynamics. And to summarize, I think we can identify three main paradigms that that are predominant in the study of the Naqab Bedouin. There is firstly an Orientalist paradigm that centers on culture. So here, this is the paradigm largely used in pre-Nakba, but also also continues in Israeli scholarship. So here the concern is largely with Bedouin political cultures of honor and feuding. The Bedouin is often presented as the archetypal exotic other, as the roaming nomads. So largely questions, as I said before, largely the questions center around how do the Bedouin live, and later then this also is formed into the question of how to then rule the Bedouin. Of course, this paradigm is characterized by very essentialist assumptions, and very little attention is paid to outside factors. The whole political context is not problematized in such a paradigm, a cultural-centric paradigm. Now, the second paradigm is the one concerned with modernization, one that we see largely emerging in the sedentarization period. So here the focus is prominently or mainly on the changing relationship of the Bedouin to the urban space, but also focus on their interaction with a variety of modern state institutions and services. The focus, the key words dominating this paradigm are one of transition and adaptation, how to integrate the Naqab Bedouin into the modern state system. And here, of course, the problem is that all this is based on an idea of an unchanging traditional society that faces the dynamics of modernization. Now, the final paradigm is one focused, or is the one on marginalization and agency, one that emerges largely in the post-Oslo period. Now, this paradigm, as I said, is produced largely by new institutions. We can say that there has been a shift in the structures of who produces knowledge on the Naqab Bedouin. While the early scholarship is largely dominated or largely emanating from the university, now increasingly also NGOs act as producers of knowledge on the Naqab Bedouin. This, of course, does not mean that there's no politics around this knowledge production, and we might want to ask also to what extent these new structures of knowledge production might produce new structures of governance as well. There are also this third paradigm focused on Bedouin marginalization and agency also brings with it the fact that there are new voices producing that scholarship. So we've seen in the last decades increasingly a revolution, one might say, around the authorial voice on the Naqab Bedouin, and it is increasingly indigenous, local scholars who write and produce knowledge on the Naqab, and therefore Mansour and Sarab will later be the representatives of this new voice. But I think, to finish, the most interesting thing, or the most interesting dynamics in this third paradigm concerned with marginalization and agency is that increasingly the study of the Naqab Bedouin is situated rejects the modernization paradigm and is situated within a settler colonial paradigm. So there's no longer a consideration of how to modernize the Bedouin, but rather how to resist a settler colonial context. There's also increasingly, and we have tried to contribute to this with our book, a shift towards integrating the study of the Naqab Bedouin within broader Palestine studies, so to see them not as something distinct from the broader Palestinian developments, but rather try to trace the commonalities. There have been studies on cross-border relations that show very clearly that there have historically been, and there continue to be today, very close relations between the Naqab Bedouin and the West Bank and Jordan, refugees in Jordan, etc. So we built on a scholarship, and we try to propose this also as a framework that sees the Naqab Bedouin as a part of the history of Palestinian people, rather than one that is dominated by a trajectory from nomadism to modernity. So overall, we have aimed in this book to situate the Naqab Bedouin studies within wider Palestine studies, as well as within the settler colonial paradigm. Although we use the concept of indigeneity, we also try to be careful not to essentialize Naqab Bedouin, or to try to somehow use this concept of indigeneity as an idea of being frozen in time, but rather as something evolving. And we also, when we use when we want to try to integrate the Naqab Bedouin studies within wider Palestine studies, we try to be wary of the fact not to simply present them as Palestinian nationalists, but also see the very frictious and sometimes ambiguous relationship that can also evolve from Palestinian nationalist narratives that appropriate local actors. So when we speak of integrating the Naqab Bedouin into wider Palestine studies, we don't want to propose that there is something, some kind of inherent Palestinianness or unified identity, or that they are unified by this concept of indigeneity, but rather we use this because we see that the historical and present political predicaments are very similar across different Palestinian localities, and therefore we use this concept of settler colonial studies. We are interested in how the framework of settler colonialism can link the different Palestinian communities and the study of them, and we see the Naqab Bedouin as very much part of that. I stop here, and I pass the microphone to the new voices of critical Naqab Bedouin studies.
شكرا صوفي.
Well, thank you, Sophie, and thanks, Mandy, for organizing such a great event. And it stopped raining for some time, which is good. Well, I think adding to what Sophie already argued, I am going to speak about one particular chapter of the book, which is I entitled basically The Politics of Non-Cooperation and Lobbying, the Naqab Bedouin and the Israeli Military Rule, 1948 to 1967. And I will basically bring new voices also about this particular military rule that has been marginalized in the Palestinian literature and in the Israeli literature. And talking about the Naqab Bedouin and the Saba, it has been mentioned briefly in the current literature, and I would like to raise the voice also of bringing oral history and oral stories, as well as archival research. I have done in the past few years in London, in Kew Gardens archives, as well as the Israeli archives, and extensively I've done oral history interviews with local indigenous Bedouins about their experience of living under military rule. And I will argue basically that the Bedouin themselves that were perceived as victims, as passive recipients, and has no agency and voice, that they in particular resisted the military rule in different ways, using different non-violent political and cultural methods of resistance to circumvent the military rule system, including even campaigning for their land, for their rights, even seeking unifications with their fellow tribes who were expelled in 1948, as well as gaining their rights as refugees and internally displaced peoples, and pursuing claims to their lands and confiscated properties, which basically, this argument that I'm going to put forward is basically challenge the perceived wisdoms about the Bedouin as being passive, despite that researching significantly Israeli and British archives as well as oral history interviews, I think I would bring different voices about resisting the military government in different ways. So to start with, the Zionist image of the Naqab and the southern part of Palestine has been viewed as an empty territory, by David Ben-Gurion himself. Like I'm using the first quote from Ben-Gurion letter to his son Amos in the 5th of October 1937, and the way he had perceived the Negev as reserved for Jewish citizens whenever and wherever they want, and by saying we must expel Arabs and take their places, and if we have to use force, we have force at our disposal, not in order to dispossess the Arabs of the Negev and transfer them, but in order to guarantee our own rights to settle in those places. And this was the image of the southern part of Palestine, in particular, the way it has been presented by the Zionist leaders, in particular David Ben-Gurion. And in order to control that particular territory, the Jewish lobbying overseas, in particular in Britain, lobbied for colonizing this particular piece of land, which was 60% of the historic Palestine, basically. And in this case, you can see this ad from the Jewish Chronicle from 1940, which basically says by Sir Frank Sanderson, who was the Conservative Party member of the British Parliament, and who basically described the Naqab as an empty territory in Palestine, claiming that this area should be colonized by the Jews, and the time that had come for the Jews to colonize the Negev. And this has been perceived, this area has been perceived as an empty spaces, and it has to be basically colonized by the Zionist movement. So I think the Negev was quite, or the Naqab was quite significant in terms of colonizing the Palestine, and it was important for Jewish leaders overseas. And I would say even according to this particular Jewish Chronicle, it has been presented the Negev now or never, which basically puts forward the significant importance of this territory later on. Well, the focus of the paper now, basically, of my presentation of this particular chapter will be on the military rule. In order to control the remnant Palestinian Arab minority in Israel, since 1948, Israel created a military rule which basically designed to govern or control the Arab minority in general, not only the Naqab situation. According to this particular quote, as you can see also the map, the way it has been divided, the country has been divided basically into 4 Arab districts: Western Galilee, Eastern Galilee, the Little Triangle, and the Negev. The Arabs and their villages in each of these districts are under supervision of a resident military governor. The 4 military governors majors in Israeli Defense Army are in turn under the direct supervision of a military governor general, who is directly responsible to the Prime Minister office. the Jewish towns, villages, and settlements in all areas of the country are, of course, under civil government. There are 100 inhabited Arab villages in the territory presented under Israeli control. This does not include Bedouin encampments in the Naqab, and this is how the way this particular or the Palestinian minority has been perceived, basically as a security threat, and it has to be controlled. And in order to basically move from one place to another, the entire Palestinian Arab minority were asked to seek for a permit in order to move from one place to another. And I called this, or I argued this in my chapter in particular, that this was a regime of permits. Like, without having a permit, you won't be able to move even from one tribe to another, or from one territory to another. And this particular quote I'm taking from a British archive report, which says clearly all Arabs under military jurisdictions must have permission from the competent military authority to move from one place to another. This permission is usually granted that the Arab has a legitimate and worthwhile reason for leaving the area. He or she may obtain a permanent permit, renewed monthly, if he is a businessman, for example, legitimately engaged in the pursuit of his affairs, or a government employee whose work necessitates his traveling from one district to another. That represents the whole situation of the Palestinian minority in Israel, not only in the Naqab. And the image there, you can see one of the military posts, the remaining military posts that we see nowadays in the Naqab. It's basically near Rahat or Kibbutz Shuval. Now, moving to the Naqab, which basically you can see this particular map, which is the enclosed zone map on the right, and on the left, that was basically the distribution of the Bedouin tribes before 1948, and post 1948. You can see it's basically northeast of Beersheba today, which basically the entire or the remnant 11,000 or 13,000, as Sophie mentioned earlier, were pushed to live in an enclosed zone, basically. And in order to move from one place to another, you should get permit from the military governor and go to the military post. Sometimes you might wait for the whole day in order to get that. Sometimes you will not get it, a permit to move from one place to another. And I'm taking this particular map from Ghazi Falah's work, who've done probably the first book in Arabic in the 1980s about the Bedouin and under the military rule. This particular permit system basically created a lot of dilemmas for the Bedouin themselves to survive under harsh conditions, and this has in particular basically made life very, very difficult under military rule, which basically later on the Bedouin has to basically to resist such domination or permit system in order to be able to survive. So post 1948, post the creation of the military zone, probably one of the first policies that were used by the Israeli authorities is basically to expel what they categorized as disloyal tribes. So in 1948, the military officials met the Bedouin tribes, which was called in a conference in Beersheba in November 1948, and the entire Bedouin leaders who turned up to the meeting basically were asked to swear allegiance to the new state in order to be able to stay. Otherwise, you will be pushed to leave. This particular case doesn't represent the whole paradigms that we have seen in different contexts about whether the Bedouin swore allegiance to the new state in 1948. Very interestingly, the British Archive reports provide details about resisting loyalty to the new state, and even some of the tribes didn't show up to the meeting in 1948. In particular, the Azazmi case. And this particular quote from the Public Record Office shows clearly how Israel treated the tribes later on because they didn't turn up. And I'm reading this particular quote, that Israel's version is that these Bedouin, basically referring to the Azazmi, numbering 700 persons, belong to the Azazmi tribe who formerly lived in Auj al-Hafir, a year ago, when the Bedouin tribes gathered at Beersheba to swear allegiance to Israel, the Azazim were absent. They were on the other side of the Israeli-Egyptian border already. They began to filter back into Israel later. They were reportedly giving a choice of where they want to go and are said to have turned northeastward into the Hebron area. It is denied that any force was used, and the tribesmen are said to have taken all their possessions with them. However, the United Nations reports says clearly that in this particular case, Israel expelled after they resisted the loyalty oath. In fact, 7,000 to 8,000 Bedouins from the Azazim sub-tribes were expelled across the international border into the Egyptian territory. And this is basically according to the UN Truth Supervision Organization that observed the borders at that time. So I would argue here that swearing allegiance to the new state was one of the tools of controlling the Bedouin tribe. But however, in this particular case, it was not successful, since archival reports shows that some tribes, in particular like the Azazme, didn't turn up to the meeting or didn't swear loyalty to the new state. So there has been an act of political resistance, I would argue here, by not turning up to those particular meetings and resisting attending the meeting in Beersheba. The second important issue under the military rule regarding to the Bedouin themselves were the issue of Bedouin refugees, similar to Palestinian refugees, but unfortunately we haven't seen very much written literature on this particular case. So the picture you see here, basically it's an image of Bedouin being expelled from time to time between the borders, and this particular case of the Astana family in 1952, which basically they populated the village of Laqiya nowadays, and were expelled in 1952 and were not allowed to come back until 1975. And the most important book for this particular case, if you want to read further, was the Hudson, The Violent Truth, one of the military observers at that time. Despite that, I would say that the Bedouin who were moved basically from the western part of the Naqab to the enclosed zone didn't submit their rights as refugees, looking in particular at the IDF archives and give a time which I managed to look at particular cases of Bedouin tribes who basically insisted and wrote complaints and letters, even in Arabic, asking the Israeli government to allow them to return to their land, or at least to gain the right for collecting their properties. So there were a few cases that I came across in the 1950s. Even the Azazme themselves didn't submit, and they sent letters in the 1950s to the Israeli officials, the Israeli military governors, in order to be able to claim their properties, or even to be allowed to return to live on their land. So in this particular case of internally displaced people or refugees, I think according to some of the testimonies of the Bedouin who survived the case of 1952, for example, that the Bedouin were powerful than we expected. They negotiated with the Israeli officials. They managed to get the UN to intervene in such cases in order to be able to be allowed to claim their properties or to return back to their land. One of the most interesting cases during the military rule that took place in this particular time frame was the economic and social cross-border relations between the Bedouin tribes who lived in the Naqab and Bedouin tribes who were expelled basically to Jordan or to Egypt. In particular, the Bedouin showed very kind of clear evidences of supporting the Bedouin tribes who were considered as refugees and infiltrators by even hosting them back to in their territories secretly, and hiding them from the police from time to time. And this has been one of the most significant cooperation between Bedouin tribes cross borders. So if we look at the situation in the 1950s under the military rule, the Azazmi lived on both sides of the border, some in Egypt and some in the Naqab, and some even didn't have Israeli ID cards. They had Israeli military cards, and they were basically free moving from one place to another and cross the borders. So it was very hard to control their movement. As a result, there has been significant support for their fellow Bedouin refugees who came from time to time, and in particular in hiding infiltrators who were considered by the Israeli officials as illegal. The second important case was basically the cross-border cooperation. And in this particular case, fascinating stories that were told by Bedouin interviewed, as well as archival evidences showing that the Bedouin tribal chiefs had secret meetings in the Naqab dealing with conflict resolution cases, and that without having any permits from the Israeli or the military authorities. It's a very interesting situation where the majority of the Bedouin chiefs, and in particular tribal chiefs who were expert in blood feuds and cases of conflict resolution, were not here anymore. So as a result, they needed those particular experts in order to help them in cases of blood disputes, for example. And in this particular example, the Israeli State Archive reported about this particular fact, which I'm quoting this particular report, that the headquarters of all the tribal groups whose members live in Israel have remained in Egyptian or Jordanian territory, a fact which, considering Bedouin blood relationship, loyalties and solidarity, has encouraged them over and over again to cross the borders, and very often to take their orders from their chiefs in the countries that proclaim their constant enmity toward Israel, as well as to carry on economic relations and inevitable by product. That's a quote from an Israeli archive report about these particular secret Israeli or secret Bedouin chiefs relations that basically came to deal with conflict resolution cases. This is as a result of that the Bedouin tribal court system was severely affected before or after the war. So as I argued, in many cases it was almost impossible to deal with blood feuds without qualified Bedouin judges. So they needed the judges that were expelled or they settled in the other part of the Jordan, either of the border, either in Transjordan or in Jordan or in Egypt at that time. This particular economic and social cross-border relations also shows some interesting narratives from women. I also interviewed it for the purpose of my research, which basically women played a significant role in feeding, for example, infiltrators and also developing very, very interesting national songs, Aghani Wataniya in particular, in supporting the cause of refugees to return to their land. And I'm taking a short quote here from a Bedouin woman in this particular case, which she said in the 1950s and 1960s we lived in Tel Arad, a long and attractive border economy route close to the Jordanian border. And in fact, we witnessed many border incidents, such as refugees who were killed or were injured, others who were trying to return home to their land. As a result of seeing the daily interactions in the borders, Bedouin women themselves started to recite Aghani Wataniya in support of the return of Bedouin refugees, which was one of the most interesting stories I've heard in the Naqab, and even using lyrics in particular to show the refugees that the police is searching the area. So once they've heard this particular lyric and songs, the refugees or the infiltrators basically hide or cross the border immediately. So those kind of, I would say, silent resistance and cultural forms of resistance that were used in particular by Bedouin women. And I think I had this interesting conversation with Nadia a few days ago about this particular cultural forms of resistance. So in my mind, and according to my understanding and reviewing the whole debate on resistance, I think we should also consider cultural and silent resistance in order to be able to understand what is resistance after all. It doesn't have to be violent. And the last important what I call basically section here, the politics of non-cooperation with the military rule, which I borrowed from the work of Jean Sharp in particular, where I argued here that the Bedouin used the concept or the tool of non-cooperation with the military rule. The first thing was basically by ignoring the military rule orders and regulations. We meet as Bedouin chiefs, we meet the military governors, we meet the military chiefs, and we listen to their orders. However, when we go back to the tribe, we basically we don't implement any regulations that were presented by the Israeli officials. In particular, Bedouin Bedouin sheikhs who were asked to report about border incidents and refugees and infiltrators, and many stories of Bedouin sheikhs show clearly that the Bedouin sheikhs themselves didn't report to the government about infiltrators or refugees or border incidents or smuggling goods, for example, or infiltrators who cross the borders. So that was kind of a very significant form of resisting the military rule regulations by not implementing and by not listening to the orders of the officials at that time. Interestingly enough, the very important aspect of Bedouin claims for land ownership existed in this particular time, 1950s and 1960s. We all hear about the braver debates nowadays, and the Bedouin have no land ownership, they have no claims, they have no land deeds. However, very interesting dynamics happened during the military rule. And the first example, in the 1950s, the Israeli officials met the Bedouin tribes and even asked them, once they swore allegiance to the government, that they paid taxes, and they collected taxes from the Bedouins in 1951 in particular, and they were ready to listen to the Bedouin and even recognize sometimes that the Bedouin lived here and we should consider their land ownership as an important issue here in dealing with the Bedouin. So in order to make such cases clear, the Bedouin themselves even started from the 1950s claiming their land ownership. It's not a new phenomenon with a brother. I think it has existed in the 1950s. And many examples from the Israeli archives, from the oral history interviews, which shows clearly this kind of land struggle and even political resistance in order to claim land ownership, in particular to go back to their land. And I give just a few examples. For example, one of the most well-known cases was the Sheikh Musa al-Atauna, who basically was fired from his position as a sheikh because he campaigned for Bedouin rights, in particular land rights. In the 1950s. This is a classic example of disobeying military rule instructions and also claiming for land ownership. And the military governor at that time, the Major bin Hassamir, reported clearly that the Bedouin activity over land issues, we're talking about the 1950s, confirming that he has received field intelligence that a number of Bedouin sheikhs has organized committees to deal with land affairs and even to complain to the Israeli government at that particular time. 1958 is another example of writing petitions to the Israeli government to recognize Bedouin land ownership. Writing to the Israeli Minister of Justice, for example, asking the government to recognize and address their claims. And always the sheikhs put the argument that they have been waiting for years in order to get their land issues resolved without any satisfactions or response from the Israeli government. So petitions, imagine petitions in the 1958 is a very strong form of political resistance, and also people writing in Arabic, and even sometimes and some of the letters I've seen in the archives also written in Arabic and Hebrew, which basically shows clearly that the Bedouin didn't wait until the Berber just came in and started to claim land ownership. That did exist in the 1950s, 1960s, and I would argue even stronger than today. That particular harsh conditions of a military government. Well, the case of Al-Araqib, which we all know about this, military archival reports from 1960s shows clearly that the Al-Uqbi family sent formal letters and petitions to the Israeli Prime Minister and asking the government to allow them to return back to their land, which they were expelled from in 1951. This has been a case, a significant case. It didn't appear just in the last few years. They claim that their land, which is still empty until now, hasn't been used, and we have the right to return and to claim our properties. So I think that campaigning for land rights was not something new. It did exist under a harsh military conditions. And the last example I will give in 1965, which is before the modernization era, just a few years before the establishment of Rahat and Tel Saba, a number of Bedouin sheikhs, 18 Bedouin sheikhs in particular, also wrote a petition to the government that they are forbidden from cultivating their native land and from being allowed to return to their land, and also using the term لاجئين الداخل. Imagine in that particular time we're internally displaced people, and we still live on other tribes' land, and according to our culture and traditions, where it doesn't work. Basically, living in other tribes' land, we have to be able to go back and live in our land, and their request was clear. Recognizing their land ownership by the Israeli government as it has been recognized by the Ottoman and the British mandate, which says clearly that they have some idea here. It's not something that they have no idea about land ownership. And also they asked the government to solve the Bedouin problem of being IDPs, internally displaced people, and to be able to return to their land. And the last point they raised in that particular letter was a solution that the government has to resolve this land ownership issue before initiating any policy of moving them to towns, which basically was clear. They knew that those forced urbanization is coming. So let's recognize our land rights before we move to towns, which is a very interesting case as an example. So to conclude, after conducting significant number of interviews as well as archive research, I think evidences were found during the military rule that the Bedouin had agency and also resisted culturally as well as politically by using non-cooperation and lobbying, as well as political and cultural resistance to reduce the impact of the military rule, and even to reject the whole military regulations, which I would say played a key role in the survival of the Sumud mechanism, living under military regulations. And the whole notion of claiming land ownership was not something new that we've just seen when the Berber came in. It has been it has existed also during the military rule, which also provides some agency and the whole idea of Bedouin land rights I think existed at that particular time of the military rule, which basically provide or challenge the perceived wisdom and the perceived paradigms about that this particular community was passive and has no voice and no role and affecting their future. Thank you.
That's it, sir. You need to. Okay, thank you. It's a break.
Okay. Thank you, Mandy, the Kenyon Institute. Good evening, everyone, for hosting us in this lovely place, I must say. It's a change, quite a change. I will speak about the shift in studying Bedouin women and gender in Bedouin society, focusing on educated women, and argue that even those post- and anti-colonial studies fall into the Orientalist trap of cultural representation, excluding non-representative identities who do not follow the authentic image created by colonial discourse. And I will do it by my own, my own ethnographic journey in the field during the the beginning of the of 2000. Well, okay. I will start with a brief, a very short experience. A few years ago, in 2006, when I completed my doctoral studies, I submitted my candidacy to several competitive Israeli foundations for a grant that would be sufficient to support me then, two children, and my husband, who were to accompany me to my study trip. The criteria for such grants are usually excellence and academic prominence, and I am pleased to say that I was awarded one of them. However, the amount was insufficient. Since I traveled with my family that has to be supported, I therefore asked a wealthy Jewish Israeli woman for supplementary assistance. To my astonishment, this woman was taken aback by the enormity of my request. You did not grow up in a Bedouin locality, your financial situation is not so bad, you are not disadvantaged, and you have enough money. Well, another incident that happened, well, the right, only okay. Okay. Two young Bedouin girls were murdered by their father last year, if you remember this event. The Israeli media revealed that when their mother had gone to the police to complain that he was planning to kill them, the police appeared more concerned with the question of how a Bedouin woman had managed to get to the police station in the first place. We can see here that Bedouin women actually have been locked in these representations as an essential category of cultural framing. This problem is not raised only by, of course, not recently by Bedouin researchers, indigenous, non-indigenous researchers, but also by a post-colonial feminist perception. And here I am linking between gender studies in Bedouin society and the wider post-colonial feminist studies that concern about the issue of Middle East Muslim/Arab women's representation that are considered to be dominated by men and culture, lack of agency, veiled, expelled, and isolated. The post-colonial studies of Arab and Muslim societies include a wide range of studies that address the use of women's representation and bodies as a tool for colonial intervention, particularly through the rhetoric of the politics of rescue supported by the discourse of universal women's rights. This is something that serves the cultural binarism. It is a colonial tool to control and manage the other. Muslim women are represented as being oppressed by three main cultural markers connected with oppressive Muslim culture: female genital cutting, enforced veiling, and honor crimes. Also, the issue of authentic voice was raised by the post-colonial critique. Colonial researchers' quest for the authentic representative of the native voice. This representation is something that should be discovered or exposed. It creates a real image of the native, and any other representation that does not follow this real, authentic image is actually perceived as unreal or untrue, like what happened with me. And it's only an example of other women who do not follow this colonial authentic image created by Israeli forces in the academia and also in public. And also here again, the real image should be of that woman as a victim. She should be veiled, helpless, and thus non-feminist. Post-colonial critique actually focused. I managed to divide it into 4 discourses, and I will elaborate upon by the case of gender and Bedouin studies. I examined it through 4 rubrics. This critique focused on the discourse of power, resistance, and agency, which actually, I can say in one very shortly, it focused on cultural sources of power, on local meanings, on giving various definitions for feminism and agency. The discourse of women and modernization, a critique about the loss of the traditional power sources, how this discourse actually creates binarism between what is traditional, archaic, primitive versus modern, enlightened, and progressive. The discourse on the public and private domains, and this dichotomy that the post-colonial critique and mainly feminist Middle Eastern feminism highlight the benefits of the separation for women, feminine networking. You can read a lot of this work. Abu Lord Laila wrote about it, and others as well. And finally, the discourse on Islam and the veil, which address the religious sources of power and Islamic feminism. Critical reflection on Bedouin women's research. Bedouin women have been locked in this representation. Till recently, shukran, Bedouin were treated as nomads, as my colleagues mentioned, mainly emphasized through or examined through the cultural identity rather than individual identity, and this analyze had no link to any national religious identities as Muslim, Palestinians, or as Arab, or other identities. This locked representation, it's a stereotypical cultural frame that reproduced this authentic identity by a few cultural markers or indicators of representation. They addressed women who cover their heads, those women who have difficulty in speaking Hebrew, which is the dominant language in Israel, and mainly addressed problems in Israeli, in the academic or any public institutions as a result of cultural differences, not as a result of racial or ethnic discrimination. So the modernization discourse, which is used as a colonial tool, addressed women as oppressed by men and culture, which justifies the enlightened liberal Israeli intervention to save Bedouin women from Bedouin men by either forced displacement. We heard in the news also by local leaders of or initiatives of the Praver Plan. After the big demonstration that occurred in the Naqab, they started to search or to justify this displacement and to search for other reasons, and one of them was saving Bedouin women from poverty, by the tool of modernization that the Israeli offering. Lately, we heard the Shamir minister, his suggestion to deal with polygamy in order to minimize the number of Arabs in Israel through women's bodies and through the family. The modernization discourse addressed the failing of the Bedouin Arabs to adjust to modernization, either to modern education, to public employment, because of their tradition, either because of sex separation, others call it society of shame. It ignores the responsibility of the state and the state institutions, policies, laws in discriminating and creating these gaps. Thus, modern change is not offered, but it is enforced on the Bedouin population. and as a way to delete archaic traditions to enable the liberation of women. This discourse does not address liberating practices that are embedded within culture and community. So the modernization discourse aims to keep Israeli culture superior and the Arab Bedouin culture inferior, and mainly to control, it justifies, gives legitimacy to control the Arab space and exclude the other and rule it and dominate it. Another tool is used, it is the politics of fear, in general treating the Bedouin as invaders or criminals, and more precisely treating women through the politics of veil. Veil is being perceived in recent studies on Muslim women, mainly in Western countries, as something imposed, oppressive. It's a cultural marker of discriminatory Islam. The fear of the veil is actually the fear of Islam as terror, Islamophobia. The shifting discourse that has occurred, I can say, starting from 2000s, where the new generation of women, of educated Bedouin women, and also foreign women, but mainly educated Bedouin women, who started to study their society and to raise taboo issues, to raise new discourse, and to challenge the old paradigm. They challenge the modern binaries, reframing the modern discourse in the context of or seeing Israeli enlightened, what used to be enlightened academic institutions, as oppressive, as not addressing women's need, not only as a liberating force. If we look at studies that have been done on educated, and here I address mainly educated Bedouin women, the issue of education and the women in education received attention starting from the last 10 years only, because it is a new phenomenon that occurred in the Naqab because of the political history and the military control, and so it started later on. So when you look at these studies, not a lot, by the way, not many, that studied Bedouin women in higher education, they mainly addressed Israeli higher education institutions as liberating forces, as enlightened, as institutions, forces that help Bedouin women to get out of her village and to receive or absorb a new Israeli liberating modern force values. The shift in the modernization discourse also focused on the interlocking power systems, not only on how Israeli hegemonic powers operate alone, but also how they cooperate with both tribal and patriarchal systems that trap Bedouin women, for instance, in polygamous marriage, in employment, in the public sectors, and so on and so on. Patriarchy is not something, according to these studies, that occurred because of tradition or because of culture. It is also something that has been strengthened by the colonialism or colonial tools as well. Okay, I can move on. The most important thing in studying lately Bedouin women and its agency, focusing on their agency. The latest studies highlight various aspects of resistance and agency according to age, to generational and spatial differences. It highlights the context differences between Israeli, Palestinian versus Middle East regions. They reframed agency of Bedouin women as part of the MENA feminist discourse, and not as a separate part or as distinguished part of it, but commonalities and distinguishes also appears. And agency is also connected to the feminist activism and the national voicing that occurred during the beginning of the 90s in the Naqab region. Okay. So my main... Okay, I will move on. Okay, so I will give few examples for the studies, the very few studies that studied educated women's identities. they mainly focused on those women who still follow this locked representation. Women who are veiled, women who live only in Bedouin space, in Bedouin villages, and women who suffer from difficulties in languages and in Israeli academia because of cultural differences, but not addressing other non-representative or other identities that do not exist in this space but exist and live in other spaces. The studies, for instance, a master thesis of Roni Halevi that has been published in 2002, she examines the agency of educated Bedouin women, and I have a lot of criticism about this thesis because she also states in her thesis that she aims to highlight the agency and the voice, and despite this huge contribution to the feminist discourse in the Bedouin studies, it still falls in the Oriental trap, still interrupts overt resistance language, this feminist language that sounds more familiar and more common with Western Israeli, which is a feminism, and ignoring the covert practices of resistance that we all familiar with from the literature on Middle Eastern feminism, Muslim feminism, and so on. So still falling into this trap. Institution of higher education perceived only in terms of advancing Bedouin women as a venue for liberating them, enlightened values, but not exploring the discrimination, the change in identity, the gaps they face, the racial gaps they face, and so on. Another discourse that these studies show is the clash between civilization discourse. Show that cultural factors clash with modern values of modern education offered by the Israeli state that hinder the education of women's enrollment in schools. A lot of studies during the 80s, 70s, and the 80s, at the beginning of the 90s, addressed the topic of Bedouin female dropout. And I remember that when I wrote my thesis about this topic, I searched for a lot for literature, and the only literature I could find that explain this phenomenon actually address or blame tradition, of blame a patriarchy of not giving permission to Bedouin girls to go to schools because of their culture. But these studies didn't offer any alternative to how we can cooperate with this culture to make it easier, and where is the responsibility of the institutions. Okay, I will address the journey of my hybrid identity during the beginning of the 2000s, where I describe my quest to discover my identity as a Bedouin woman researcher who does not fit the authentic representative depiction and does not manifest uniform cultural markers such as accent, apparel, or place of residence. I discovered my status as both an insider and outsider, which drove me to rethink my identity. This ethnographic journey proposed a new identity representation that has been overlooked in the Israeli academia. Based on my personal experience as a researcher who discovered her strangeness during fieldwork among her Bedouin community, I argue that it is a counter-narrative to the hegemonic discourse, which aims to reclaim more representations, modes for Bedouin women's identity. Okay, so in the field, I was back then a single woman in my 20s. I was also a teacher, and I was, I think, the first Bedouin researcher that in my Bedouin community that started to do field work in one of the public spaces. So to our society, to my community, it was not accepted, or it was strange a bit to see back then at the late 90s, to see a Bedouin girl, driving alone with her car in the early evening, going from home to home, entering these stranger houses, seeking to do interviews Okay, so I wasn't so all this journey affected my my field work, my choice of field work, and the journey that I will elaborate on. So I discovered that I was an insider because of the characteristics that located me within the culture, my tribal affiliation, which was very important, still important in Bedouin society, and the shared experience with other women. But I was an outsider because of the characteristics that distinguished me from the expected model of Bedouin women. Single at an age when most Bedouin women are already married, at least in this specific city, non-traditional appearance, non-Bedouin accent, and living in a Jewish space, studied in Jewish school and living in an Arab and Jewish city. I realized that I was not fulfilling the cultural norms expected of Bedouin women, and that initially the participants, the women that I interviewed, they marked me as a stranger. They started to ask me, where are you from, and offer me a lot of things that were offered to a non-Bedouin girl or woman. They thought that I was from the north, okay, and they treated me accordingly. Okay. One example for this strangeness. Where are you from? I was asked, where are you from? I will read. Another experience of alienation occurred when I started to interview one of the mothers who suddenly turned to me and asked, where are you from? This expressed a desire to clarify my identity. In light of the external features that to her indicated that I was not a Bedouin, it was difficult for me to answer this ostensibly trivial question. If I replied that I was from Beersheba, she was likely to think I was not a Bedouin, since most Bedouins live in Bedouin villages. But if I answered that I was a Bedouin woman, this would give rise to additional question: where was my Bedouin residence? Where was my Bedouin dialect? Where was my Bedouin appearance? My reply was therefore complex, as I had to explain that I was a Bedouin woman who did not look Bedouin in the traditional sense, that I was a Bedouin woman living in Beersheba, a daughter of a Bedouin father, a non-Bedouin mother, and speaking her mother's dialect. I was aware that my answer would complicate our interaction, as it would disclose my cultural affiliation and lead my interviewees to classify me. In order to overcome this otherness, I tried to highlight some common elements, as happened with other Middle Eastern researchers in their own countries. My Bedouin family name, which brought my tribal affiliation, okay, and this protected me as being perceived as an honored, respected woman who does not violate cultural codes. And also, back then, my role as a teacher protected my presence in the community's home in irregular hours. I also was placed as a daughter of my father. As a researcher, I had to obey cultural codes that I never followed as a young Bedouin woman. Driving my car alone, observation in mixed-sex public spaces, entering strangers' homes, all these seemed violations of codes of honor bothered my father, that he was working in the clinic of that same space, which which I needed back then to start to think how I'm going to protect my feminine reputation, my father's honor. So I decided to drop out of the observations. Okay, I couldn't continue doing the public observations, but this status also helped me in interviewing men with the presence, of course, of their wives. So the dilemma was that why, when being a researcher, do the local feminine norms apply to me, even though I do not follow them in my everyday life? If I am so different externally and in terms of behavior from my subject of study, what makes me belong? If in my daily interaction with Bedouin society I had proved my modesty and morality without the necessity of following the feminine norms, why did I now have to prove it again by accepting those norms when wearing the researcher's cap? Okay, so all these dilemmas, all these dilemmas that I elaborate more and more, you can find in the chapter of the book. I didn't brought it all here because of lack of time. I'm asking to expand the notion of Bedouin woman's self, focusing on various eyes, not only on the with. I claim that exposing the researcher's identity reveals another research story about the nature of cultural, social, and gender relations. this identity reporting, for me, is the most, or is another direct observation of what happened in this and other societies. So from here, actually, by focusing on my own stories, I want to bring another modes of representation and break the category in the public discourse as well as in the academic discourse of the Bedouin woman. Thank you.